Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and you're in for a treat today. Why? Because I know this guy because he interviewed me last week. It was one of the best interviews I've ever sat through on either side of the mic. So I asked him if he might switch over and let me interview him, and he's graciously agreed to do so. Today I have Rory Paquette. Rory, first of all, thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me today.
Oh, Tom, thank you for having me on. You're an absolute legend, man. It's an honor to be here.
I'm certainly a legend in my own mind, but as my wife says, remember your head has to be small enough to fit through the front door. You have a great mission, which is to raise the level of the ocean for all podcasters. Can you tell me what took you to that mission?
Yeah, I would love to. That's my podcast, the Podcaster Nation, that I kind of pushed that mission through. I had a podcast before that called Power Man. I've opened one since called Wake Up the Lions. But the mission on the podcaster side was I was meeting a lot of podcasters through my initial podcast, and I was sitting there and I was looking at all these things for multi-level marketing and a couple of other fields. And it occurred to me when I was sitting there one night with my wife in the living room, I said, there's nothing that highlights podcasters and brings them up, brings them together, talks about them. There's no catalog, there's no show or anything. And she said, really? That seems weird. So we kept looking into it and we just couldn't really find what I was looking for. And I said, wow, that's kind of crazy. And my wife goes, you need to start one then. And I said, you know what? You're right. I need to start one. I said, hey, we're going to do this and we're going to create something where everybody can come on. Doesn't matter what your podcast is, doesn't matter what your belief system is, doesn't matter what your topic is. You can come on here, you can speak freely about yourself, your beliefs, your interests, zero judgment, nothing but information, sharing and raising everybody up. And it sounds like a pipe dream, but everybody that's come on has bought into it 100%. And it's been just an absolute wonderful ride.
Rory, can you give us a taste of your professional background before you discovered podcasting?
Sure. Yeah, I was in sales most of my life. I'm an old sales dog. And so I've sold pretty much everything under the sun at one point or another, but I hit my peak in real estate. And so I was very good at that, sold it for a very long time, owned several real estate or one company with several offices. I had a bunch of people working for me. That did not work out in 2008. Anybody who's old enough to remember it remembers it and they get it. After that, it was survival. And then it was passion. And it was, hey, what do I really want to do? What's God calling me to do? What am I going to be able to kind of push forward in my life? And at one point, my wife said, look, I know you love to write. So I started writing some books. And then at some point, I was listening to a podcast, and my wife again said, you have a fantastic voice. How come you're not doing a podcast? And I said, I don't really know. And so I said, what am I going to do it on? And then once we decided on that, it was okay, we're going to do a podcast. So let's get this going.
So, what was the Power of Man about?
Power of Man is about helping fathers and husbands to, first of all, realize they're not alone in their struggle in this world. Fathers and husbands are, men in general, are beaten down by the society an awful lot. They're beaten down by the economy. And very often they beat themselves down with the high expectations of providing and protecting and leading. And it's a difficult place because we put so much pressure on ourselves. I had a very difficult time at one point in my life. And when I had to go through that, I went through it completely and totally alone. And coming through that made me realize that I don't ever want anybody to have to deal with that. I don't want anybody to have to go through that kind of stuff alone. And so I decided I wanted to put out a helping hand. And if I could help at least one man who was going through something similar to what I was going through to not feel like his back was against the wall and he had no options, then it was worth doing. And that's kind of where it came from. And that's what it's about.
So, how do you get men to open up and be vulnerable?
The first thing is you have to let them know it's a safe place and you have to lead by example. One of the things that I realized early on was that men today are having a really real problem with leading. We're constantly being told, "Hey, take a back seat. Hey, calm down. Hey, don't be too masculine. Hey, don't be aggressive." All these things, and in our hearts, we want to lead. We want to be out front. We want to be the first one through the wall, taking the hits, so that our family is safe. It's who we are. It's in our DNA. And I think just knowing that, I said, "Look, if I'm going to get men to open up, I'm going to have to lead by example." And so my first almost 30 episodes, I think, were solo episodes of me talking talking about my marriage, talking about my children, being a father, talking about job, career, money, life, health, all those issues and all the struggles that we all have as men, as fathers, as husbands, and letting guys know, look, I get it and I'm willing to talk about it. And slowly but surely, the comments increased, the DMs increased, the listenership, of course, increased, the social media picked up, and guys were really responded and going, man, what you said on that one episode, dude, brother, that was it right there. And you start hearing a lot of that and you realize these guys are opening up because you're going through the wall first, taking the bullet.
Yeah. So tell me about the podcaster nation. You told us about your vision for it. Has the vision you had met the reality of the show?
It's a great question. There, we've had a couple of sticking points, of course. I get the occasional comment on how can you support that and how can you support this and how can you talk about that. I got so much hate when I started Power Man that by the time I got to Podcaster Nation, I'm kind of bulletproof. This stuff just bounces off, Tom. With the podcasters and with the podcasting community, yes, 100%. The mission is being met with the reality. Folks who are on the show, and hopefully you can attest, really love what we do. They enjoy coming on. They like being a part of it. And one podcaster doesn't care what another podcaster's talking about. It's just the few people that are out in the crowd that are sitting in their basements, keyboard warriors who think they can have an opinion on stuff that want to throw up some hate every once in a while. But that's the vision, is to let everybody talk about whatever they want to talk about. And this is their podcast. If they believe in it enough, Tom, to do a podcast on it, then, I'm going to give them a platform to talk about it.
So the when we visited on your podcast, what impressed me was the breadth and scope of your knowledge around podcasting. What I mean by that is there are lots of podcasters who focus on audio or the creative process or the story or the technical side of things or the monetary side of things or the social media promotion. But you're able to ask a complete set of questions around all of those different areas. And I guess it got me thinking, because as a podcaster, I have to think about all of that, particularly around my networks. Is it common to, when you talk to a podcaster, they really are thinking through sort of all the different parts of it, or do people tend to specialize in what they enjoy the most?
Wow, that's a tough question. It's a good one. By and large, I think people have a comfort level with certain things. I think there's some folks that are sort of natural question askers. They're hosts. Some people are natural guests. They could just talk about themselves forever and could fill up a whole show. And the podcaster could just sit there eating a sandwich and get through the episode saying hello and thanks for being here. So there's a lot of folks, I think, that excel at their thing. There's very few, I think, that really study it like it's their business, but I've seen that growing. More and more I'm running into people who are really looking at, how do I want to do this? And they really want to do it right. So I hope that answers the question. And for you to say that I knew a lot of stuff, I appreciate that very much. Coming from you, that's a huge compliment.
So why the podcasting format? Why did that intrigue you so much as opposed to writing? You've already talked about your books or some other type of communication format.
Yeah, I did. I wrote 2 books. I put them out there. One was really bad, one was really good, and is still doing well. But, writing is something I love, but I didn't feel like I could connect with folks. And then even if people were buying the book, I didn't know if I was really connecting with them. They might buy the book and be, wow, this is garbage, and toss it. You have no idea. But I wanted to connect with folks. Social media was like an option, an attraction. Podcasting was huge in my mind. And all my life, I've been told, oh, you got a voice for radio, you got a voice for this, you got that. And I've always kind of been a good talker. I've been in sales my whole life, so I think it's natural at this point. But I love exchange. And I love being able to sit here and have a conversation with somebody and something comes up. You and I could be talking and you could go a complete different direction than what we thought we were going to be in. And then it's a whole new conversation. That just lights me up. I love that. And so I said, I got to do podcasting. I give it a try because I know I can talk. I know I want to interact with people. And it all just kind of seemed to line up for me.
What I didn't understand was that we both know about podcast conferences. There are 2 or 3 large ones in the United States. Now there's some large ones outside the United States as well. but there wasn't a podcast focusing on podcasters. And it both dumbfounded me and made a lot of sense. At the same time, the dumbfounded part is I can't believe we're not doing this. The part that made a lot of sense is someone who sees a market need or market opportunity and moves in to fill that market need or market opportunity. And so it seemed to me that you certainly fell into the latter category, which was exactly what you said. Nothing is celebrating the podcaster, so let's do it. How would you assess the community has responded to that clarion call?
Incredibly well. The very first thing I did when I decided to start the podcast was I put out a post in one of the groups that all the podcasters are in, and I told them what I wanted to do. And I outlined the mission. And I got 165 responses from podcasters, all going, "This is awesome. I'd love to be on the show." And the next thing you know, we're up and running and we're flying. So I ended up basically having to turn it into a full-time job at that point, if it wasn't already, just to get all the interviews done. And it was amazing the way it all got picked up. And to be honest, it really hasn't stopped since then.
I think it was pre-pandemic. I was on a panel with some podcast hosts, and the question was, number one, how do you prepare? But number two, how do you help the guests prepare? And the other two seemed to me to be more journalists than I was, and I'm certainly not a journalist. And they didn't share their questions with the guest, and they wanted to surprise them with questions and get their reaction. And I'm like, what the bleep? No, there are no surprises on my podcast. In fact, I'm here to celebrate them. And that kind of the first clue to me that there's different ways to do this. It's a long-winded way of saying, what do you think makes a good host?
I wasn't sure we were going with that, but all right, I got you. Yeah, I don't actually send over the questions, but there's a reason for that. And it's because my podcast is so conversational and I want it to be that way, but I never try and trap anybody. What I do, and a lot of people do a pre-interview, for instance. I don't. I do a maybe 10-minute chat before we record, but I do a ton of research. I do as much research as I can do. I listen to their podcast episodes. I'll read the book if I can get a hold of it before they come on the show. And if they're trying to push a book, look at the course. I download stuff off their websites, whatever I need to do to get to know the people who are coming on whenever I can. So I do all of that. So I already kind of have a good idea of where I want to go with it. But then when I get people on, I give them a good idea of how it's going to go. And I say, hey, I'm going to do this, and then we're going to do that. And then I'm going to ask you these couple of questions. But other than that, it's conversational. Relax, talk about whatever you want. And they're like, okay, cool. This is not normal, but and honestly, my goal at the end of it is to just have them smiling. So what makes a good host is you have to remember that the episode is about the guest. And I just really believe that the episode has to be about the guest. If you want to talk about you and your beliefs and your stories, that's what a solo episode's for. When you bring a guest on, you are there for the guest. And so I'm very big into, hey, do you have a course or a book or something that we want to make sure we talk about? How are you getting the most out of this today? I verify information. I double check name pronunciations, the whole bit. But I think the biggest thing to being a good host is that you have to care about your guest, and you have to realize that's why you're there.
So in terms of, wow, I was going to say, leave them smiling. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
That's a pretty good way to think about that. Have you had the opportunity I assume you've had the opportunity to interview hosts in a wide variety of genres, everything from true crime to sports to self-help to everything in between, business, compliance, etc. Are there any common themes either on the business side? That's not right. Are there common themes for B2B podcast as opposed to maybe a fiction podcast or something a little more freeform?
When you're talking to folks, there are. Yeah. When I'm talking to folks who are running business podcasts and their podcast is intended for businesses and they help businesses start podcasts, things like that, there are a lot of very common themes that they deal with because they're in the same business. Just like when I am talking to fortune tellers or psychics or hypnotists, they have a lot of the same stuff. When I'm talking to pastors, people who are very heavy in their faith, there's a lot of the same stuff. People in their different genres do definitely have patterns and things that they are going to have in common, ways they're going to answer questions, things they're all going to be worried about. And you learn that pretty quick when you start talking to multiple people in different genres. So I hope that answers the question. But yeah, they definitely do have things that are in common.
I'm a big advocate that every business should have a podcast. Do you feel that way, or is it, do you think, limited to certain types of businesses or certain types of personalities?
No, I absolutely agree. I couldn't agree more. If you have a business of any kind, if you're a large C corp, if you're a small independent contractor, if you're an insurance guy or a realtor or something, if you have any kind of business where interacting with the public is important to your success, absolutely should have a podcast. It costs almost nothing to start one. You don't have to invest a whole lot in huge equipment. It's just, if all it is you talking about your business that gives you that instant credibility of having a podcast, you must have a podcast. If I'm trying to decide who's going to list my house and I have two realtors and one of them has a podcast and one doesn't, boy, the one who has the podcast looks a whole lot better and has a whole lot more credibility in my eyes as a homeowner than the other guy. So yeah, I absolutely.
So part of my podcast production process is to create social media sharing assets based on the podcast. Do you see podcasters using a variety of assets created from the podcast, including potentially a blog post, show notes, or other medium that they can use? Or is that something that it's really down to the individual podcaster's interest?
Not nearly enough, I think is the best way to answer that question. There's so many podcasters who think if I just post it once, and put up a link, then everything will come. If I build it, they will come. And it's like, hey, this is a business for you. You built it, you recorded it, you got to put it out there. If nobody knows you have a podcast, nobody can listen to your podcast. We've talked about it before, there are a ton of social media assets you can create. And I think that people are scratching the surface with that, with some of the technology that's out there and chat GDP and CapCut things and stuff like that. So you're seeing more of it. But by and large, there's folks who really just don't know what they don't know, and not nearly enough.
Let me flip over to the podcast listener. Do you have a handle on who is listening to these podcasts in any way, or just the numbers we hear bandied about?
I have a pretty good idea of who's listening to mine. A lot of that is through interaction. Of course, we all have numbers and metrics and everything else. I don't really pay a lot of attention to downloads. I think that's just one of the most useless numbers in the world. I have people who follow my podcast religiously who listen to it once in a great while. And if I talk to them about a particular episode, they'll tell you, oh, I didn't really catch that one. But by the same token, they're all over the social media talking about what a great podcast it is. And they're involved in a private group that I have talking about it. But they just don't have the time to sit down and listen to it. They listened once or twice. They're a fan. They love it. They love the idea. They're in. So they don't necessarily catch every episode. You know what I mean? I know who I'm talking to because I know how to kind of take my numbers and take my info that I get from engagement interaction and put those things together.
And what do your numbers tell you about your podcast?
Power of Man is roughly 85% men. We do have a large female base from what I thought we'd have. About 15% of our folks are female. The females that we have are very supportive of the podcast. We lived through the hate and the haters a long time ago. So they're all gone now. And we really don't get any of that anymore. The ladies who were part of it are either listening for their husbands or with their husbands, type of thing. I know one in particular is constantly talking to her husband going, that's not what Rory said in his podcast. So you got to work on this. And that poor guy is talking to me all the time going, Rory, man, you got to stop this. You're killing me at home. So we get some of that. Podcaster Nation, we have a ton of podcasters because I'm running into that all the time where podcasters are going, hey, I heard this was cool. Maybe I'll be on the show. I'm not sure. But it is a ton of podcasters, which is awesome. So yeah, that's kind of who we are.
How's been your how has your experience been with Podmatch?
I've really enjoyed Podmatch. I've pretty quickly, I guess, established some credibility on there. I went into Podmatch with the same attitude that I've always had. That my episodes are all about my guests, and people in Podmatch come on my show, and one of the things they tell me is, number one, I had more fun on this show than I've ever had on a podcast.
That's true.
I
can
appreciate
attest to
that. Number two, man, you asked really good questions. Like
You do.
you got to some stuff and I opened up about that I never had before, that kind of thing. But mostly it's just appreciation because I'm not pushing myself and my agenda, and they really feel like they came on for a purpose and they achieved their purpose. And again, that's what it's about. I've had great reviews. I think I have over 100 5-star reviews on there now as a host. But a great array of guests. It's been a ton of fun.
So you know about my views on mistakes in podcasting, that other than one, there are no mistakes in podcasting.
There
But
you
what are some of the common maybe themes you see podcasters use for learning opportunities
go. For learning opportunities.
or growth opportunities
Yeah.
or
Again,
mistakes, if you want to call it that?
there there are a ton of mistakes that we all make in podcasting all the time. I think the best way to answer that question, honestly, is probably just you have to stop caring about all the mistakes that you make. I think that one of the things that makes a very good podcaster is you have to care about what matters and you have to stop caring about what doesn't. I see people who will spend hours and hours editing something because they have to get every single background noise out. They want every little pause taken out. They want every word to sound perfect. They're worried about the sound level. And I'm like, oh my goodness, hit publish and move on with your life. Nobody cares. So I'm all the way the other side of that whole thing. I don't edit. I gave it up a long time ago. I just don't. If I've had a cat crawl on a lady's head in the middle of the thing and she's laughing and we're laughing, that's in the podcast. I had somebody drop off because her internet connection was horrible. Well, we waited and I talked like it was a rain delay at a baseball game. We're bringing her back on, guys. Don't worry. And she comes back on and we both laugh and we keep going because that's life. And that's what happens. Most podcasters would lose their minds if that happened to them and go, oh my God, how am I going to piece this together? Don't hit publish, move on. Nobody cares. So I hope that answers that question. I'm not sure.
So, with this body of work you have, what do you want your listeners to walk away, not the guest, but the listeners to walk away with?
That's a great question. I guess that's a little bit different for my different podcasts. For Power of Man, I really want my listener to walk away knowing they're not alone. That's always been my mission from moment one. I want them to know there's people like them out there, that other people have their worries, their concerns, and they're simply not alone. I've had a lot of men reach out about very serious things who didn't think they had anybody else to talk to. And some unknown guy on a podcast says something that matters, and all of a sudden they're ready to reach out and talk about it. So that's huge. On the Podcaster Nation, I really want my listeners to understand that podcasting is amazing, that podcasting is a fantastic community and a wonderful world. And I want them to appreciate the guests that I have on at that time. Even if you don't agree with what they're talking about, or even if you've never heard of it, or even if it's something that sounds dry as yesterday's toast, I want them to still appreciate what this person's putting out and the work that they're putting in.
Rory, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode. But before we
Okay.
leave, I wanted to ask you, could you tell us where the podcast you host could be found?
Yeah, absolutely. All three of my podcasts are on all of the major platforms: iTunes, Spotify, everywhere. They're all on YouTube under their names. And if anybody wants to kind of connect with all of them at once and me, the hub, the best place for all of it is just my personal link at Rory Paquette, my name, at Facebook. I post everything there. It's kind of where I house all of it and then ship it all off to the various places.
Well, now we have to explore that. Why Facebook?
I started with Facebook because it's my most comfortable place. That's where I started. I've also looked at a lot of who's listening and who's interacting where. I'm a 55-year-old guy, and a lot of the people that are in my demographic, so to speak, older folks, have kids, empty nesters, kids who are high teens, things like that, they're on Facebook. That's just where they are. That's what I've found. Now, Instagram has its pluses, LinkedIn has its pluses and minuses. I have no use for TikTok. That's just me. But Facebook has been where I've made the connections that have made me successful. So I stick with what works.
Very cool. Roy, I thoroughly enjoyed having the opportunity to visit with you. I'm fairly certain we're going to continue these conversations.
I would love that. Thank you, Tom, for having me on.
Okay, we're off.